All right. Thank you for the introduction, Janice, and thank you for having me here today. Very excited to see this side of the industry and what you are all working on. So great presentation so far, and now we'll kind of go into the 4Rs, and a lot of what we've already talked about here this morning is a great transition into this topic. So with that, learn how to use this clicker. This is myself, just some goofy photos. Our booths at the Ontario Outdoor Farm Show, we're always incorporating 4Rs. And so we try to make it fun, get that message out. It's a lot of educating on 4Rs nutrient stewardship and how we can all work together across different groups. So just myself, this is really just to show that I like to go to meetings, but I'm very much involved in the 4Rs and sit on lots of boards and like to talk about that. So what is 4R nutrient stewardship? What are 4Rs? Is everyone pretty familiar with that concept here? And what the 4Rs are? I'm going to talk about it anyway, but looking at the 4R nutrient stewardship, so it's really a science-based framework that looks at the implementation, the validation, and communication of those efforts in regard to 4R nutrient stewardship. And it was created in mind to have those 4Rs in conjunction with the 3 pillars of the sustainability goals that were already created. So combining those two worlds and as a communication tool. So when it comes to 4Rs itself, we're talking about nutrients. So whether that's fertilizer or we talked about organic amendments this morning, it's nutrients that are being applied to our fields, to our crops. So we're looking at the right source of nutrient, applying that right source at the right rate, the right time, and in the right place. So that's what we're going to get into here today. So here's those sustainability goals that I mentioned earlier. And so in conjunction with those 4Rs to match up with these sustainability goals. So we're looking at economic, environmental, and social goals to reflect all of those 4Rs and coming together as industry, as stakeholders to achieve those different areas. And I think just alluding to some of the questions earlier for Ryan's presentation, this is a good explanation or how we can come together. So many of you being farmers in the room are obviously part of agriculture. We are on that more that economical, environmental side of things. So with the sustainability goals, there's economic, environmental, and social. And so there's performance indicators within the 4Rs on this side of the chart here. And so we can see that they all match up to those sustainability goals. But each of those performance indicators, looking at, say, soil health, the productivity of your farmland, all those 4R type concepts, they're hitting about 2 of those sustainability goals, not all 3. There's not one indicator that is hitting all 3. And so the relevancy of each of those is going to be decided on that stakeholder that is actually participating in that area and what their goals are. So it's really about coming together. We want to make sure that we aren't over-focused on, say, one indicator where we are really, say, achieving all of these environmental and social goals, which is a great thing, but the yield is really impacted from that farmer standpoint. So we want to make sure that there is a balance and vice versa, and all working together and communicating to achieve that same end goal. So with that, dig deeper, we'll go into my wheelhouse of the agronomics of it all. And so again, looking at that right source of nutrient at the right rate, the right time, and in that right place. So saying here, none of those 4Rs can be right if one of them is wrong. So we're really working in synchrony and working together with those 4Rs. And as I go through each of them, I'll probably still refer back to, oh, this one, and then we go back to this other R. And so using them all together within that cropping system. So I'm just going to go through a few examples, agronomic examples, in each of the 4Rs to dig a little deeper, and maybe it's a practice you could implement on your own operation or work with your customers. So looking at the right source, one component of right source would be looking at supplying the nutrients in plant available forms. So that source of nutrient that we are applying, we have to understand how it works. And a great example to explain that is sulfur. So there's different forms of nutrients, sulfur being one. There's an elemental and a sulfate form of sulfur. Elemental, there's a little bit that is available in that first year, but you're more applying it so that the crop has it in consecutive years, whereas the sulfate form is available right now for that crop. So looking at that source and understanding, so an example would be a premium product called Micro Essentials, as said, where that has both forms in it of sulfur. So you can apply that product, you're feeding the crop for this year, as well as building that bank for further on. Another portion or example for right source is recognizing blend compatibility. So we all know that we can mix some products, we can't mix others. So taking that into account. One of my favorite topics or stories is distribution. And so an example I like to use is looking at boron. So boron being a micronutrient, very extremely important nutrient, but just needed in very small amounts, micro amounts. And so how do we distribute that evenly across the field so that all plants are getting it? If it's applied in too large of an amount, we can see here in this diagram on the left that that one boron granule was applied where that red bar is, and so those bars are all representing plants. And so if there's too much boron, it can actually be toxic to those plants. And we can see that the toxicity level is there for the plants, but all of those bars or plants around it are still deficient in boron and aren't receiving that nutrient that it's needed. So a solution to this is using a proper source, a different product, and Aspire is a solution to that where there's a little bit of boron in every granule. There's other products you can spray on or coat your fertilizer, your nutrients to help with that distribution and get those nutrients all over. If we want to do a little shake-up or demonstration, if everybody wants to stand up. And then those online, just imagine a room of people standing up. Come on, let's stand up. All right, everybody is a granule of fertilizer. So I just spread my fertilizer blend, and you're all looking really great across that field. Okay, so let's say it's potash, and I've added a bit of boron to it. Now, if your name starts with B. This is a risk, Nicole. If your name starts with B, I want you to stay standing and everybody else can sit down. Ooh, that worked out great. So now, everybody that's standing, your name is now boron, and you are a boron granule today. And so this is a blend. Yes, I like that fist pump. And so for those online, I apologize not including you, but there's a few people that are stayed standing. So this is an example of a blend where we just added boron to that blend. And all of these Bs, these boron granules, are spread throughout the field. Actually, it worked out to be not too bad, but all of the plants in between are not receiving that boron. So that's what we're talking about, distribution. And if we go back to before, when everybody was standing, and that was a blend that had a little bit of boron in every granule, we can really see what that difference is, okay? So thank you, all the Bs, all the borons. So just a few extra things with right source, looking at your soil, your physical, your chemical properties within your soil, looking at different elements and synergisms is a very complex world. Something great about the 4 R's and that nutrient stewardship concept is that it is quite simple in a way, the 4 R's, applying the right rate and right source, etc., that we can all understand or appreciate from different groups and backgrounds. But then once we get in and dig deep a little bit further, we can see that complexity of it all. And so that's where we get into this here. And looking at that nutrient chart, I guess there's interactions. And so we don't have enough potassium, and that's going to limit the uptake of nitrogen, for example. You can keep applying as much nitrogen as you want, but if your potassium levels aren't there, it won't be utilized the same way that it could if you had a full balance. We want to make sure that we know exactly what we are applying in that source. What's that guaranteed analysis? Using controlled or stabilized nitrogen blends, using nitrogen stabilizers, and we'll come to that in a little bit. Secondary micronutrients, extremely, again, important in that whole nutrient interaction, and we want to make sure that we're soil testing. So swinging into our second R, right rate here, we want to make sure that we understand the rate that we are applying. Okay, so this is a bit of a busy slide, lots of charts, numbers, but just pulled from OMAFRA publication 811 to show that the nutrient removal for each of those nutrients across a variety of crops. So understanding your yield and how much we're pulling off is really important because, you know, the higher the yield, we're all really happy, but the greater the nutrient requirement will be, the more nutrients that will be removed from that soil. So this is a good problem to have, but we need to make sure that we're applying the right rate so that we can grow the best crop and are supplying that nutrient or that soil with what we are removing. So looking at corn for an example here on this chart, just pulled some of our average yields for corn across Ontario. 2004, the Ontario yield for corn was 131 bushels. Down to 2023, last year, the Ontario provincial average was 171. So that's a great success story that we are increasing our yields and through a lot of these best management practices that we've been discussing today. But the point of this story is that, I guess I have a pointer. Here we go. Yes? Well, that's embarrassing. Anyway, look at the chart. Here we can see our removal rates. So our P2O5, our phosphorus, and our K2O, our potassium, we are removing quite a bit of nutrient from the soil in that corn crop. And so looking from 2004 to 2023, we increased the yields and we can see how much more nutrient we are pulling from that field. So really important when it comes to that right rate. Along with that, so that's looking at yield, what we're removing, and of course, if you're growing something like forages or corn silage, you're removing all of that stover, and so more nutrients are being removed from the field, so it's a little bit different opposed to just, say, grain corn in comparison. So again, putting all of that into your crop plans and your management practices. Then we get into the soil test. So soil sampling is the number one in my heart. We need to be soil sampling, soil testing, understand exactly what's there. I like to use the analogy of, say, my bank account. I can't just go blindly pull $100 bills. I wish I could do that, but I can't just go pull $100 bills without knowing what my original balance or statement was, okay? So same thing when we're pulling those nutrients out. So here's just an example of a grid soil test. So every 2.5 acres, we're pulling a sample, lots of different ways to soil test. But this is just an example, and you don't need to know all of these numbers. It's nicely color-coded, green being high or a good amount for fertility for that soil type. Down to the red is low or deficient in that soil. So we can see that there's quite a range within and across the field. Even just looking at our removal rates, these are from OMAFRA, these numbers. The soil test will drop 1 part per million of your P for every 35 pounds of P2O, your O5, your phos that's being removed from that field, and soil test will drop 1 part per million. K, your potassium, for every 17 pounds of potassium removed from the field. So it doesn't take a lot for your soil test to drop when we're growing these big crops. And here's a nice correlation, again, making sure that we're applying the right rate, not just within the whole field or across the whole field, but within the field in different areas. We can see that variability exists. So that's part of the right rate and getting into the precision ag world. And so here's just a correlation. This is actually a map from the States, but just to show. This is a yield map of soybeans here on the left. The dark blue is the highest yielding areas of the field, down to the yellow and the red are the lowest areas, yielding areas. And to our soil test, the darkest green is the highest soil fertility, highest levels of potassium. The lightest green is the lowest numbers. And so we can see that correlation between the two maps there, where we're pulling out the monster yields in the northeast corner of that field. Our soil tests are the lowest, and those levels are really building up in the bottom. Oh, I think it's a me problem. There we go. Oh, there we go, the bottom left. The soil test levels are quite high, and that's where our yield is very low. Does that make sense to everybody? It was a bit of a head scratcher. We're pulling those nutrients out, right? So again, just with right rate, lots of components to each of these R's. I'm just quickly showing one quick example for the agronomics, but the rate-specific economics, fertilizer use efficiency, coming back to nutrient sources, it all applies. When we get into the right time, this is where we're assessing the timing of plant uptake. And so the crop is all going to change or be a little bit different. But we want to make sure that we're applying those nutrients to match the crop demand within the season or for that particular crop. So a lot of that can depend on your planting date, your growth characteristics. There's sensitivity to different deficiencies at different growth stages. So again, understanding that whole crop and its life cycle. But for this example, we're just going to focus on corn here today. So looking at the nitrogen uptake in corn chart, we can see that in those first 40 days, there's not a lot of utilization of nitrogen in the growth of a corn crop. And so when we're going and applying all of that nitrogen up front, it's just sitting there waiting to be taken up, which it's not by the corn until a little later on. So it's really susceptible to loss. And so we want to mitigate those risks, mitigate those losses. And so we can do multiple applications of nitrogen. So put a little bit on up front and then come in season and apply it at the right time when that corn crop actually has a need. So we're protecting the environment, we're protecting your fertilizer dollar, we're getting more efficient use of that nitrogen by applying it and feeding it to the crop when it is actually needed. And then this goes back to source, but applies. So we can use nitrogen inhibitors, and so helping to protect that nitrogen to stay where we want it to be in the crop, and so it's not as susceptible to loss. So this is just an example of having that, say, urea applied on top, and it's very prone to volatilization or gassing off on top of the soil in that conversion process. If we do put an inhibitor on it, we can keep that nitrogen there and where it should be and for when the crop needs it. So with the right time, I have to show the nitrogen cycle, of course, that you can't have a 4-hour presentation without it. So here's our nitrogen cycle. And so when it comes to right time, again, really assessing the dynamics of that nutrient supply and that nutrient loss. And so through mineralization of that soil organic matter, we can have nutrients available. But if those nutrients don't become available at the right time that we need it, we could have deficiencies even show up. And so that all depends on weather, and we know what it's like relying on Mother Nature. It can be a tough task to do. So we need that moisture, we need that heat, that warmth. And so we can help manage it with nutrients. Also leaching losses. When do we have the most water, or when in the season are we most prone to leaching? The spring? Probably now. So we need to take that into account, and that goes back to the right time of applying all of your nitrogen. I'm focusing on nitrogen, but it's nutrients. We have that potential to be lost. And so with that nitrogen cycle, there's lots of different forms of nitrogen. It is very complex of what the crop can take up or where it is available to loss. And so ammonium and nitrate are the forms that the plant likes to take up. They're also more susceptible to being lost. And so we talked about volatilization earlier, where it gasses off into ammonia and that's lost to the environment. The ammonium can go through a process called nitrification. And so that's converting to nitrate, which the crop loves to take up, but it's very easy to be lost through leaching. So looking at those lighter soils, we can lose the nitrogen through leaching, or or through denitrification, and that goes off into the atmospheric nitrogen. And that's where we're seeing the biggest impacts for those greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide that we're trying to reduce in those emissions. So having those nitrogen stabilizers and applying the right time can mitigate some of those losses. Just checking my time, I tend to go over, so I'll speed it up. Looking at the right place, I liked this chart of what a corn plant looks like, a 36-day-old root corn plant, and we can see where those roots are compared to a sugar beet. That's 2 months old, and it's more narrow and straight down. So understanding your crop and where those roots are is very helpful in where we want to place those nutrients. So maybe banding like a phosphorus as an example so that those roots are able to get them better. Managing spatial variability, this is my wheelhouse, being precision ag. Love it, it just makes sense, but tying all of that in, the right place, the right rate. This is a field that I did a variable rate nitrogen application on and just superimposed those zones over top with our spinner going through. But really looking at that crop productivity, the vulnerability to nutrient loss, and at that right time, we can make better decisions looking at the environment and what's the outcome of our crop this year. Are we getting a rain? Are we not getting a rain? And can manage those rates and in that place. This is another field just about half an hour from here, actually, in Bellwood. Went out and took soil samples to test for nitrate in season, adding another layer for our nitrogen recommendations in crop. And this was all just in one field. And so in that dark red area, we can see that the soil, and that's just the color of the zone that I created through imagery and soil sample layers. But we can see how the soil really changes from a lot lighter, finer texture down to a more cloddy, heavier, clayer type of soil. And so we're gonna treat those all a little bit differently. For the sake of time, I'm going to continue on. So that's just some of the agronomic practices that we can do or to apply to those 4 Rs. And then I want to get into the Ontario 4R certification program. So Janice alluded to the contributions and collaboration with OFA. Very appreciative of that and all the work that you're doing, and for Janice representing all of you on these committees here. And so this 4R certification program was created for the agri-retailer here in Ontario. It's also on PEI in states across, various states across the states. Ohio is where it really all started, and a lot of our standards were developed from or in conjunction with. And so it's originally was designed to reduce that phosphorus runoff, but now really looking into nitrogen and just really nutrient stewardship as a whole. And so, as Janice mentioned, it's administered by the Memorandum of Cooperation. Again, these are many of the stakeholders that are involved, and OFA being one of them. So, how many have heard of the 4R retailer certification or work with a 4R retailer? So these are all of the retailers and sites across Ontario that are currently certified, so a pretty good uptake and working across the province to continue. So I personally work for FS Partners. We have 5 sites that are certified and have been through 3 of the certification cycles now. And then the rest, shout outs to Midwest, Agris, Silvite, Home, Setteringtons, Southwest Agri-Mart, and then we've got PT Sullivan Agro, Warner Ag as more independents, and Belmont Farm Supply. So a tremendous amount of effort. Really appreciate all of those retailers and the work that they've done to communicate and execute this retailer or this certification. So within the certification, there's 36 auditable standards that we as a retailer are assessed on. There's training, so that education, huge education piece for us to be educating not only our own staff, our applicators, our agronomists, but also the growers and general public on 4R nutrient stewardship. There's recommendation standards, application, and then all of our documentation that we have to keep and then provide for a standard or a audit every 2 years. This is just an example. I'm not going to bore you with all of the standards, but an example of what we abide by. So an example of a recommendation standard that we get audited on is discussing nitrogen management options. So split application of urea or nitrogen using slow release technologies or nitrification inhibitors. Those are all part of management practices that we as a retailer are promoting and recommending to you as a grower. So some benefits of working with a 4R certified retailer, working with CCAs, the certified crop advisors, and the 4R nutrient management specialists, being part of the solution, good stewards. So we want to, as Ontario, we want to represent Canada and really show our benchmarking for 4Rs and what we're doing for everybody and working with all of those groups. So the phos and the nitrogen losses, and then getting into those nitrous oxide emission strategies and goals. 4Rs is a great way to provide that. And then just even on your own site, you have great resources and this FAQ on what those emission reduction targets look like and how they apply to 4Rs. So sorry, that was kind of quick and fast, but we'll stop there if there's any questions. Half hour goes fast. Essex.
Interested in your crop removal slide.
Yep.
And how it affects our soil tests.
So, you want me to go back? Oh.
Used was 171 bushel crop, which is pretty low. So if you look at the last 3 years, like we've been harvesting 100 plus bushel wheat, 60 bushel soybeans, and 200 plus bushel corn.
Absolutely.
Are you, so when you come to crop removal, numbers, those are substantially high numbers.
Absolutely.
Is that like almost a 1-to-1 ratio as far as removal compared to yield? And if we look at our beginning part per million soil tests, where we're at now, that's just like that one chart that showed, it's getting depleted like pretty quickly.
Very much so, yes. So great question and great conversation. And so the 171 bushels for corn yield is just the Ontario average. So just for everybody to kind of relate to, but you're working with your specific goals, looking at your yield data. And part of the certification for the 4Rs is when we're creating recommendations, we need to have an attainable yield goal. So what are you actually pulling off that field to use those removal numbers? It's not a 1-to-1, depends on the nutrients. So, your phosphorus to your potassium are completely different. So, and for every crop, it's different too. And then if you're pulling off that stover, so it is significant, the amount of nutrients that we are removing and that are needed to grow that crop. So when it comes to 4Rs, something that's great about it is that it's a broad concept, but we can use it at an individual basis. And so we see all of the counties across here, your fields all act very different, and even within your county across the road, that field is different too. So we have to apply those concepts and those nutrient removals, the yields that you're obtaining specifically, and can kind of rejig that around. I don't know if that was really an answer. It's more of a conversation.
And apologies to our folks online because we had a mic issue, so we weren't able to capture that question, but I think you did a really good job of continuing the conversation. Nicole, was really about crop removal in relation to applying 4Rs, right? One question online I want to use just to wrap up our session here in the interest of time. It was about agri-retailers and sort of where they're located and how many, and you covered that in your presentation, but the other part of the question is how can farmers help sort of advance 4R in Ontario with respect to agri-retailers or independent CCAs being certified in the process? Any thoughts you want to share on that?
I really think the education piece is large. We all have our own networks, and I'm in my network and this person is doing, say, this practice. Well, they're like-minded. They act like me. We kind of farm the same, and they're implementing those practices. I'm going to give it a shot too. And I really think if we can collaborate together and work together on that education piece, it's great. And even kind of to some of the previous questions, in addition to that, it's starting small, and you don't need to implement every 4R practice on your farm right away or at all, but starting small, really understanding where your own budget is and how many dollars are you bringing in per bushel of yield, and what is kind of my flex that I could try a new practice. We know that with change comes risk, and so how can we mitigate that risk and understand what works in your operation, I think is a great place to start, and working with your CCAs, of course, and that retailer.
And you emphasize soil testing too, which we often talk about as the gateway to 4R, right?
Yes, I love that. Yeah. We should make
Awesome.
signs.
Please join me in thanking Nicole for her presentation today.
Thank you.